So once an individual or a regulated entities made a filing the SAR, what are their further obligations, or do they have any additional obligations at that point?
Well, I think once they file the SAR,
you mentioned report. I guess you could send them a directive for additional information.
So if we send them a directive, they typically have 72 hours to respond. That's specified in POCA. So what we found is there's a very high rate of compliance within the 72 hours. Also, there may be situations where people need a little extra time. So we say to them, look, within the 72 hours, write back to us. Give us what you have or can give us in the 72 hours, and then explain what you can't comply with within the 72 hours, why, and set out, sort of suggest a suitable time frame that you think you can't comply with for us to consider.
Okay.
So that would be the other main thing. And then the other thing I should add, Patrick, is we typically issue closure letters. So I talked about sending someone no further action. Once we've concluded a case, and let's just say we've disclosed it to SIBFIS, SEMA, and 3 overseas FIUs, our closure letter would essentially say, thank you for the information filed pursuant to POCA, reference numbers. We have disclosed this to SIBFIS, SEMA, and overseas FIUs. We no longer specify which FIUs it has gone to, but we do specify the domestic agencies, because the domestic agencies may contact the SAR filer.
Right, for further information.
Law enforcement obviously can reach out. We have a working agreement with supervisors that if they're going to reach out to the reporting entity, that they come back through us so that we can reach out to them in the first instance.
Right,
and say,
okay. We're a coordinated response.
SEMA has requested to contact you, and so we put them in touch with each other, and then.
Okay, and I guess even in my own practice, if we have clients who will contact us, it's often they'll be talking about particular fact patterns, and then we will be advising them as, I guess, to the timing of when they make their filing. And obviously under POCA, I should mention, which is the Proceeds of Crimes Act in Cayman for foreign listeners, once somebody either knows or has this reasonable suspicion of a particular offence or money laundering offence, then obviously the obligation is an immediate one to file with you. What we then kind of find is once the parties made that filing, and we'll move on to talking about sort of a slight change in our regime coming up, and sort of almost a defensive filing, people then do start to get concerned about what other possible offences they may now need to be aware of, and the next point we normally raise in our discussions with clients is the tipping off offence. I mean, in that regard, I guess there obviously are real risks of tipping off, and there's obviously an offence around prejudicing an investigation as well. But do you have any sort of views or advice on how people navigate the risks around tipping off?
Well, I have views. I can never advise. I mean, every time tipping off comes up, my default is sort of to read the law, because although I think some of the wording's not the easiest, because it says a person commits an offence if A, the person knows or suspects that an activity in relation to which disclosure is required to be made under this act is about to take place, is taking place, or has taken place, whether or not a disclosure has been or is likely to be made in relation thereto, and B, the person makes a disclosure which is likely to prejudice any investigation which might be conducted following the disclosure referred to in paragraph A, whether or not the investigation is conducted. So in layman's terms, I always say, if you're going to file a SAR, you file a SAR, you're going to file a SAR, or you may file a SAR, and then you turn around and say something to someone that could prejudice any investigation that might arise out of that SAR being filed, particularly any investigation that might follow. I think that puts you squarely in line for a potential tipping off offence. So I typically say to people will what do I say, what do I do, even if I don't do something that could be tipping off, if, there's a transaction pending. And I'm not a lawyer, seek legal advice, but I mean, pretty much you kind of know what you can't do. You can't say to your client, hey, this is held up because I've got all these concerns about your activity, I've stuck a SAR in.
Exactly.
I think,
So even if the client has their own suspicions, as long as you, as the filer, know.
That's my personal view. I mean, obviously, I think it's more than that, but I think, I often say to reporting entities, these are situations that you should offer staff training. You should maybe even go through a few scenarios that might arise, and sort of have a script for people to sort of go to. And obviously, I mean, I think institutions that have face-to-face interactions with clients that are doing transactions immediately, it's more problematic. But I think, over the years, people have developed their mechanisms for doing what they have to do. I think usually compliance divisions get blamed a lot, or compliance is doing a check or requires further information. So compliance officers, I think, are always getting thrown onto the bus.
Yeah, and I think that as you said, that's the good advice in terms of having the relevant training and having a script, if that's going to help staff, particularly if you are in a high transaction sort of environment. And certainly reaching out for legal, regulatory counsel. Maples were obviously always available to help. So traditionally people have filed their SARs, and we sort of call them a defensive SAR, then moved on to maybe conducting their transaction. We're just about to change that regime. There's obviously the intent that you can still file a SAR if you have a suspicion or know of some potential criminal activity. But if you are in a high transactional environment and you're about to then enter into a transaction, we now have a new consent regime, which is the new Defence Against Money Laundering, or a DAML regime. Are you able just to explain some of the requirements of the DAML regime and how that will now work in practice? Now, this is in effect from January 2025, so it's a new area for people.
So sure, as you said, prior to January 2nd, sections 133, 134, and 135, you had an automatic defense against any of the offenses there if you filed a SAR.
Correct. So people would sort of file that defensive SAR and move on.
Yeah, I don't particularly like the word defensive, because it infers that people have stuck SARs in when they really didn't need to, and it's more ocean on the 136 or 137, depending on who you were. I mean, we do look at the timing of SARs, because those sections require you to file the SAR as soon as practicable, which obviously that can be open to interpretation. But for example, if a classic case would be if someone files a SAR and it's on adverse media that's existed for 2 or 3 years, it does beg the question about the timing of the SAR. And it could very well be that the adverse information was only discovered recently, which triggered the SAR. But that could then raise the question about, well, what kind of ongoing monitoring and sort of scrubbing is going on.
What sort of framework are they? What is their compliance framework like? Yeah.
So now, simply put under the DAML regime, and rather than citing all the specific commencement orders and the names of the legislation that have changed it, now SAR filers also have to have the consent of the Financial Reporting Authority to conduct a specified act. And we've used that term because that's the language used in POCA. So if you look at sections 133, 134, and 135, there are specific activities that and again, those sections are specific to criminal property.
Right.
So, 133 talks about, I think, concealing, disguising, transferring, and a couple of other ones. 134 is, I think, entering into arrangements. And 135 is use and possession. I know there's a third element. So, if you're going to do an activity that could give rise to an offence under one of those sections, they now say that you need to file a SAR and have the consent of the FRA to do so.
And so this sort of mirrors the UK regime that is in place. And I guess just to give some context this is really not, is not Cayman changing the rules, but more to meet, I think, a change in focus from the FATF. Is that correct?
Correct. So the fifth round methodology, so the methodology that's going to be used to assess jurisdictions in the fifth round has changed from the fourth round.
Right.
And one of the big changes, and there's a lot of changes, luckily my core recommendations, recommendation 29, which is about the operation of an FIU, hasn't changed yet.
Right.
But recommendation 4, which is about confiscation, has changed, and there's now a specific provision in Rec 4.3 that essentially summarizing says that jurisdictions must have mechanisms, including legislative measures, for the FIU or other competent authorities to be able to suspend a transaction or refuse consent.
Right. So I guess it allows them to slow us down a wee bit so you can then make that confiscation order.
If there's a suspicion of that it's connected to money laundering, terrorist financing, or predicates, and then it says, and whatever measures you put in place, the timing for suspending or refusing consent should be suitable for analysis or other actions such as restraint orders to happen.
Right, so there's a practical element to this in terms of how fast can the mechanics of industry move and regulatory bodies to enforce those suspicions.
And so that requirement under Rec 4.3, because since recommendation 4 has changed, in the fifth round, the assessment process is going to be different than the fourth round. In the fourth round, you were assessed on all 40 recommendations and all 11 immediate outcomes.
Right, so it's critical for Cayman as a jurisdiction as well to have this as a pillar to the regime.
My understanding, it's just my understanding, I have to stress that in the fifth round, the technical compliance assessment is going to focus on recommendations on the review, i.e. recommendations that have changed since the fourth round. So they're not going to look at all 40, they're going to look at the recommendations where the methodology has changed from the fourth round methodology to the fifth round methodology. And Rec 4 is clearly one of those. Recommendation 4 on the fourth round methodology had 4 criteria to satisfy, and now it has 13.
Right.
And one of the new ones in the 13 is this requirement.
And obviously this is a global requirement, and it's great that Cayman has satisfied all of the prior requirements. They actually see
it is a global requirement.
Focus on the new shift. Yeah.
A number of other jurisdictions have DAML/consent regimes. I'm going to call it DAML because in the FIU space, we just prefer that because, for example, in the UK in particular, they moved away from calling it consent. The law still says consent, but they talk about issuing a DAML because there was this connotation that by the FIU consenting, it somewhat legitimized the transaction, and that's not what's happening. It's essentially
defense.
It's providing a defense against one of the specified offenses.
And I think that's a very valid point for people to take away as well, that it is only a defense, and obviously you do have your wider obligations. There could still be a potential breach under, for example, Terrorism Act or a different piece of legislation. So just because you may have a defense to one of the sections under POCA, there are other considerations. And given that there's a period of time here between the filings when transactions may take place, circumstances may change, additional information may come to light. So I think as a regulated entity, for example, before entering into a transaction, you would probably want to reassess your position anyway, regardless of the response. Obviously, if you've been given consent, to still think about it.